Let me give you two general ideas about writing hard news. First of all, readers like to see themselves in stories. They like to read about things that affect them. So let me give a couple of examples of that. Every newspaper, every TV station will write about multiple homicides. So let's say there's a triple homicide involving a drug deal gone bad in a part of town where most of our readers and viewers don't go. My guess is that they will be more interested in a minor break-in, somebody trying to jimmy the windows of their next-door neighbor's house, than they are in that triple homicide, because somebody trying to break into their neighbor's house affects them. It prompts them to do something differently. Lock their windows, for example, or look over their shoulders. Newspapers and TV stations every time will write about or broadcast about the triple homicide because it really is kind of compelling, and I'm not suggesting they shouldn't. I'm simply pointing out, don't ignore the more minor things that might have a greater direct impact on people's lives. Some examples of this. When I first became the editor of the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, we had a story about a couple that was out for dinner one evening in downtown Boynton Beach, Florida. Boynton Beach is a suburb, maybe 30 minutes north of Fort Lauderdale. They're out for the evening, and at the end of dinner, they're mugged, or a mugger tries to mug them. The husband in the couple beats the would-be robber, sends him scurrying, thwarts the robbery. Well, on one level, this is a minor story. There wasn't a crime. A crime didn't occur. Nobody was hurt. Everybody just went their own way. I thought it was a wonderful story because people could see themselves in it. Every one of us imagined, what would I do if I was this guy? Would I beat the robber and thwart the robbery? The answer, by the way, is yes, we would. Or everybody would say, would my spouse or partner do that to protect me? Well, we'd all imagine that. So I thought it was a wonderful story. It became a front page story. Another example of this is that newspapers and TV stations tend not to report on domestic matters the way that they would if something was more public. So a couple of brothers or a couple of friends get into a fight, and maybe one is assaulted. That's going to be treated differently than an assault of one stranger versus another stranger walking in a public place. And the difference is that in the domestic situation, you can't see yourself in it unless your friends and siblings are going to beat you up. For most of us, that's not the case. As opposed to a random act involving people you don't know in a public place, you will say, hey, that could have been me. I go to that place. That could have happened to me. So we treat these things differently, even though from the standpoint of the law, they're both assaults and they're both similar crimes. Other examples, city council votes, to allocate millions of dollars toward some initiative, and it involves raising the mill rate, etc., etc. Don't report it that way. Say that a new bridge is going to be built, or a new new sidewalks are going to be put in whatever part of town. That's something people can see. That's something that people can appreciate. Certainly tell them how much tax dollars are going to be spent. That's very, very relevant. But don't get caught up in the gobbledygook of government language, and tell people what the repercussions are. Somebody is traded in sports. You could write about the trade, or you could say acquiring such and such a player now makes the team a contender, or whatever the impact of that trade is. Sports fans will know. The casual fan might not know. So bottom line, what I'm saying is put things in perspective and ask yourself, what does the reader really care about in this situation? And that's the story I want to tell. A second point regarding writing breaking news stories is that the best stories are the ones that affect change, that have an impact on the community. The Pulitzer Prizes acknowledge this very openly. The Murrow Awards, which is a highly sought-after award for television broadcast, acknowledges this as well. So not every story is going to be a Murrow winner or a Pulitzer Prize winner. You can't have that, but keep it in mind as you write stories. Those stories that prompt action, prompt change are often the most valuable. So let's talk about writing leads. I'll make 4 points. Rule of thumb is that a lead is the 5 W's and an H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. This has worked for decades and decades. It still works now. But make sure you're including the correct 5 W's. Example, you might say that a person was killed in a car accident. But what if that person, and by the way, if you say a person was killed in a car accident and a person was killed, you're completely correct. But what if that person was the mayor? Or what if that person was some other celebrated person and you didn't put the person's name in the lead? Well, you were technically correct. It was a person, but you missed the point. So be wary of that when writing leads, that it's the correct and important 5 W's and an H. Second point, there are 2 sides to every story. We all know that, and it is fair to report both of them. But are all sides always equal? An example that I'll use from my experiences here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, is that of a major hospital that opened several years ago that was long overdue and multi-million dollars, and was going to serve as or has served as a regional hospital for young people. And there were half a dozen people protesting the traffic implications of this. Well, an inexperienced reporter was going to give equal weight 2 sides to the story. Here are the advantages of the hospital, and here are critics of the hospital. But are these things really equal? I'm not saying that we want to judge and say that complaints about traffic are not relevant, but it was half a dozen people protesting versus a monumental effort to open the hospital. They're not equal, and to treat them as equal really isn't giving the readers a fair representation of what happened. So, 2 sides to every story. Not all sides are equal, and sometimes you end up being unfair and disingenuous in making them so. How to write a lead. Write a lead as though you were telling the story to a friend or a spouse or partner that you saw at the end of the day. How would you say it? Well, the way you would say it, without thinking, without trying to be a journalist, is probably the way you want to write it. And then maybe clean up the language, of course, but your instincts, your natural way of communicating a piece of information is probably the best way to write a lead. It's your instincts, and go with it. Last point, avoid the obvious. Right? Don't state that a fire is tragic, or you would say it as a tragic fire. Well, all fires are tragic. Don't say that somebody was fired without warning. There's only one way to fire somebody. All cul-de-sacs are quiet and idyllic. All lawns in suburbia are finely manicured. These words don't need to be put in to paint a picture. They're really just hyperbole. So just stick to the facts and avoid those unnecessary adjectives. Let's talk about quotes. Quotes are a wonderful way to add color to a story, to make a story come alive. Use quotes to let people offer opinions or to describe something in a colorful way. Don't use quotes to convey facts. It's not the most efficient way to convey facts, and it can be jarring to readers and viewers. Likewise, it sometimes makes more sense to paraphrase what people are saying rather than to use an exact quote. Sometimes quotes ramble on and on. Sometimes people will say things using cumbersome language. Sometimes they'll go off point and maybe they'll get back on point. And if you include that entire quote, you're really not doing anybody a service. So you can convey what a person says by paraphrasing rather than quoting exactly when that's the logical thing to do. And then just look for some other circumstance within your story to use an exact quote to do what you want that quote to do, which is to make a person's opinion colorful and to make your story colorful and relatable. It is important for the reader to understand immediately who is speaking in quoted material. So let's say, for example, you've got a fire, and you quote the fire chief or an assistant fire chief, and you identify the person that way. Well, you don't need to explain why the fire chief is being quoted about a fire. That's kind of obvious. But let's say you're quoting somebody who is a neighbor who lives right near where the fire occurred. Well, if you don't identify that person as a neighbor, it isn't clear to the reader or viewer why you are including that person's quote, why that person's quote is relevant to the story. So there's obviously room for judgment here, but don't assume that the reader or viewer knows what you know, and identify a person so that it facilitates a reader's understanding of the story. When you introduce a quote, it shouldn't repeat something you've already provided, right? So you want to give context for a quote, but the quote shouldn't just reiterate that context. Example, you say that neighbors were shocked when they saw the magnitude of the fire, and that's your paraphrasing. And the next sentence begins with a quote, "I was shocked by the magnitude of the fire," said such and such a neighbor. I know that sounds silly, but it happens a lot, especially with new journalists. It happens an awful lot. So you can't change the quote, so either don't use the quote because you haven't really used the quoted material to add anything to the story, or change the way that you've introduced the quote. Change the context that you've written so that the quote now adds to what you have written, and the quote now does what you want it to do, which is to add color to something you've already stated. Another point about quotes, be aware that people speak in such a way that might embarrass them if their exact language was written down for people to read. And this really applies to written text and doesn't really apply to broadcast. You might hear somebody say, "I'm gonna go," as though they are saying Gonna. They said going to, but we speak in a somewhat casual way, or somebody orders an iced tea. They ordered an iced tea, I-C-E-D, tea. There's no need to embarrass them. There are exceptions to that. There's exceptions to everything, but one exception would be somebody whose colorful way of speaking is relevant to what they are trying to communicate. So imagine somebody who is known to speak in a southern drawl, and that is part of that person's persona. Or a hip-hop artist, for example, that purposely speaks in a way representing the kind of person he is and the kind of music he's performing. That's fine. To disguise things at that point would be disingenuous. So a little caution there, but generally speaking, for the typical person who is not used to being quoted in a newspaper article, there's no need to embarrass them. They said going to, you just heard gonna. Last point on quotes. Can you use foul language? The answer is maybe. It really depends on several factors. I don't know any news organization that has an absolute rule against it, not anymore anyway, and I don't know any news organization that says you could just do it at will. It really depends. ask yourself this. Is the actual language, the exact curse word, relevant to the story, or could you not say that a person used a pejorative word or used foul language or paraphrase what he or she said? If the answer is that the exact language itself doesn't add anything to the reader or viewer's understanding, then probably don't use the word. It would be gratuitous at that point. The converse of that is you don't want to purposely exclude foul language when the exact word itself is very, very meaningful. So, if it's two friends arguing and one of them uses a foul language, there's no reason to report that. But what if one of them is a politician, and said in a public place? Then maybe it does. I'll give an example of that. But here's an example where you wouldn't or shouldn't quote a person. Let's say you're in a locker room after the game, and athletes are speaking to one another as they do, and they speak in colloquial language, and that includes curse words. There's no point in reporting that. There's really nothing that is added to the story when you use the language itself. Obviously, I am stereotyping here about what goes on in the locker room, but that's kind of the point. If it fits in with the stereotype, then there's really no news value in using exact language. But if you are a candidate for president and you use a racist word, then I might argue that the word itself must be reported, because to describe the word, saying candidate so-and-so said something racist, doesn't really have the same impact, and somebody running for political office isn't expected to use that exact language. And so by using it, you are actually contributing to the reader or reviewer's understanding of that. And by the way, that happened, that's not a hypothetical, it happened in the presidential race in 1984 when a candidate did use a racist word, and I know a lot of news organizations used it. By the way, you will notice that in that anecdote, I did not tell you what that word is, which illustrates my point. I've conveyed the story, and using the actual word itself would not have added anything to my anecdote. It's the same anecdote with the word and without it, therefore I'm not going to use it. You want to Google it yourself, you can. It's Jesse Jackson was running for president in 1984, running for the Democratic nomination. So Google it if you want. And finally, if you're not sure, this is one of those situations where you can ask an editor or a producer or a news director. These are kinds of decisions that might be best made at a higher level, so have your own thoughts, but don't be afraid to ask. Here are half a dozen things to be wary of as you're getting ready to report a story. Be wary of threats by people to protest or demonstrate, or to file a lawsuit, or to boycott something. That's something we see a lot of these days. These are threats. Often they don't materialize, and reporting the threat itself isn't newsworthy if the event doesn't actually materialize. You're being used. An exception to this might be an organization that is credible, that is known to have carried out these kinds of threats before. An organization that has been known to file lawsuits after they threaten filing a lawsuit. Those are credible, and go ahead, report them. Otherwise, be a little bit suspect. Secondly, be wary of people who claim to represent other people or who claim to speak for a large group. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they've given a fancy name to a group, but it really isn't much of a group at all. We had an example of this several months ago. One of the networks interviewed a person representing a group with the interesting name called Jexodus. The network was Fox. The name sounds good. She was advocating Jewish people leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. Exodus, J-Exodus. Who's in this group? Nobody knows. For all we know, it's her. Now, my guess is that it's probably a couple of people more than that, but I doubt it's any kind of large organization. There is certainly no evidence to suggest it's a large organization. And that brings me to my third point. Just because a group has a website or a blog, or somebody has a self-published book or a video that they posted on YouTube, doesn't make them credible. A self-published author is really no different than anybody who stands at a Xerox machine photocopying pages of a book. You're not really published. Somebody on YouTube is not a filmmaker. Somebody with a website is not necessarily representative of a large group. Now, they might be. Check it out. Unless you know that group, you've heard of that group, or you know a person to be credible or expert in a certain subject, check it out. They might not be, and don't be influenced by what sounds like credibility. Be wary as well of non-experts offering opinions that require expertise. Now, I'm all for bringing into a story opinions from people who might be affected by it. That's fine. I don't want to be elitist and say we only will quote officials. But be wary of what leeway we give to people. Example, there's a fire and a neighbor says the fire was horrible, it was terrible. That's perfectly fine. That's the neighbor's opinion. If the neighbor says it was the worst fire in the city's history, well, you know what? Check it out. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. Does that neighbor have the expertise? Is he or she a historian or a fire chief or something? If they're not, that might just be hyperbole. The person's saying it. Check it out before you report it, even though you're attributing it to a person. That person's not an expert. Be wary of demonstrations and protests that are staged solely for media coverage. You're being used. And the news organizations love protests. We love public demonstrations. But we have to cover these things because they are happening independently of us. If they're being staged just for our purposes, it's not news, it's fake. Likewise, be wary of protests and demonstrations that include just a handful of people. Organizations will often stage a protest because they know that news organizations love covering them. We're almost trained to cover them because usually they're legitimate. Usually they are newsworthy. But you go to a protest and it turns out it's just a handful of people. Really, what's the news value? My rule of thumb is that if the number of people at a protest is equal to the number of people I can fit into my house at a dinner party, then you probably oughtn't to cover the protest as news, unless you want to start covering the dinner parties at my house. So not all protests are equal, not all demonstrations are equal. Use judgment.